Thank you, Hernando. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Nenad Georgiev, and I'm a research associate in law at the KU Leuven Center for IT and IP Law in Belgium, and also a co-lead of the regulatory, legal, and data privacy work package in PharmaLedger. And as Hernando mentioned, in the next couple of minutes, I'd like to address the topic of blockchain as a tool to protect privacy and why we believe that this technology in particular can bring value to data protection. I'd like to start off with the moment that I would say opened up a pathway for our privacy to be increasingly jeopardized some 30 years ago when the World Wide Web was created to help us easily share information and knowledge on the internet and to connect to each other. A platform that was initially decentralized and controlled by no one evolved to be a tool for a very few tech giants and corporations, which somehow along the way assumed the role of trusted intermediaries to maintain huge amounts of data stockpiled in their centralized servers. So soon after, collecting personal information in exchange for their services and then monetizing knowledge and analytics extracted from that data proved to be a successful business model for generating revenue, right? And these services that allowed us to have immediate access to information, entertainment, and goods also contributed to a big disparity between the offline and the online world. And while it's fairly easy to safeguard our privacy offline, it's become more difficult to do so online, because from the moment we connect to the internet, our personal information are collected and shared with third parties for purposes we may not even be aware of. So all of this is happening in the digital realm, right, where we have little oversight over the things that are going on behind our screens and keyboards. So basically our digital privacy has been undermined. And a couple of studies done in Europe and the United States from a few years back showed that 41% of the survey population are not comfortable with sharing their data with private companies in order to use their services. And more than half of them are worried that the data that they share online could be accessed by third parties without their consent. Perhaps even more worrying is the fact that 59% do not understand what private companies or public bodies are doing with their data online. And even 81% of them strongly believe that they have lost control over their personal information. And all of this, as I mentioned, triggered by the digitization of many aspects of our lives. Now, the healthcare system has not been immune to transformations caused by ICT. Right, healthcare is inevitably moving from paper-based to a paperless environment. And when considering the rise of big data, machine learning, and AI, for example, we cannot ignore how all of these are having a particular impact on the patient as a data subject. And when we're moving towards more personalized healthcare made possible by the datafication of our health. Now, datafication is a concept, right, that describes the ability to render into data many aspects of our lives that haven't been quantified before. Think of all these variables, like telling us how many steps we walked today, how many calories we burned, and what was our heart rate at a particular moment in time of the day. And this collection and storage of data allows for the creation of value for our overall health improvement, right? We are better informed about our health, and advances in data analytics can help create solutions in diagnosis and drug discovery, but also precision and personalization and telemedicine. So there's no doubt in the value of this data for our overall well-being, let's say, and the considerable benefits that datafication brings. But on the other side of the coin, datafication also expands the boundaries of what counts as health data and exposes us to a whole new range of actors outside recognized medical and clinical settings. Now, the whole healthcare system is already complex enough, right, with many stakeholders involved. And with every new gadget, there's potentially a new stakeholder who has the digital tools and means to know about our health and data. And we can all agree that one significant characteristic of this industry is the massive amount of sensitive information that goes in and out, and all the metadata attached to it. Now, the problem, as I said, is that this is happening somewhere outside of our eyes as patients, outside of our reach, and often even without our knowledge. Now, we are aware that each one of these stakeholders may be in possession of some sensitive information about us, and somehow are inclined to believe that everyone will do their due diligence and duty of confidence when handling this information. But we can never really be sure about this, as there is hardly a mechanism in place, let's say, to have an oversight over who's accessing this sensitive data of ours, or for what purpose. What is more, some may hold information from, say, 10 years ago, and obviously a lot could have changed within a decade. So they're essentially in possession of inaccurate or incomplete data if there is no communication with the patient. And because everyone is operating their own centralized systems, a potential attack or destruction of their servers could mean that some of our records and health data could be stolen or lost forever. I mean, the last we heard about cyber attacks on hospitals, I believe it was only 1 month ago in France. So this is not a rare phenomenon. So basically, this fragmentation of our health information across many sites and in silos leads to losing overall control of our data, and therefore I would say trust in the healthcare system when we talk about personal data handlings. Now, one way to build this trust and get more control over our personal information is, of course, by getting reassurance that whoever is collecting our health data is complying with the data protection laws that are in place in many countries. I believe there's hardly anyone who hasn't yet heard of the GDPR from 2018. And this piece of law or regulation is I would say, what most people associate with whenever data protection and privacy are brought up into the discussion. But data protection and privacy go many decades back, and the GDPR itself replaced the data protection law in the EU from 1995. So arguably, the reason why the GDPR reached such a huge audience is partly because of its strict rules that were designed to shape the way personal data are handled by those who are in possession of such data, and partly because it came at a time of technological advances when big tech and their social platforms were so widespread. And so in a way, it exposed how these corporations are using, or I would say misusing our personal information to their benefit, becoming as a consequence too powerful and in control of our digital experiences. So naturally, the laws had to evolve over time towards a mechanism for power redistribution in the context of personal data collection. And the GDPR introduced a whole range of measures designed to avoid the risks associated with the processing of personal data. It empowered individuals to have better control over the use of their data by granting them substantive rights, right, data protection rights. And it integrated accountability requirements for ensuring that those who process personal data are actually doing this in compliance with the already well-established data protection principles. So at the core of the EU data protection law lie protective mechanisms like consent as a fundamental tenet, data minimization through pseudonymization and anonymization, purpose limitation to protect the individuals, the patients from unknown users of their data, and then security requirements and data protection rights. So we have the legal foundations to take back control of our personal health information, but we also need a technical infrastructure to build on these foundations and provide solutions to help with this power redistribution. And this is where we believe blockchain comes into the picture. Now, roughly around at the same time as when the GDPR was being drafted, we saw the emergence of blockchain technology, and with it came the arguments that the technology was essentially in conflict with the GDPR paradigm. Now, avoiding some of the blanket statements that surround the discussions about this, I'd like to stress one important caveat, and that is blockchain is really a class of technologies. So there is no one blockchain, and there is definitely not one way to design it. Therefore, rather than speaking about how they may contradict each other, I'd like to concentrate on how we can actually use the features of blockchain to achieve some of the objectives of the GDPR. So in essence, blockchain is a shared and synchronized digital ledger maintained by a consensus algorithm. And one way to imagine how this technology works is to see it as a ledger that is distributed among several computers in a network. So it doesn't exist only in one central location, but rather many computers share a full copy of the entire ledger. And this capability has the potential to disrupt the current institutional environment where control can be shifted from the centralized parties into the hands of peered users in disintermediated settings. And another characteristic of blockchain is that it is essentially append only, where you can add data, but it is extremely difficult to change or destroy data on the ledger. And this immutability feature is what essentially brings trust that the data stored in the ledger has not been tampered with or otherwise manipulated. And all of the records on the ledger are time-stamped and secured by utilizing encryption and one-way hashing algorithms, where the underlying meaning of the data is obfuscated. So we have pseudonymization built in the technology. Now in PharmaLedger, we've created this vision of open data sharing units, where the main idea is that our data assets are not stored on the blockchain itself, but rather securely encrypted outside of Ledger and only anchored with a cryptographic reference in the root blockchain so that we can inherit its properties. And the vision with OpenDSU is that data subjects are in control of their confidential data by smart or digital wallets, where we can manage data access and also give consent to data processors for the confidential data stored in a secure data sharing unit in our smartphones. This way, we're minimizing the risk of writing personal information on the ledger, and therefore we're avoiding the tensions with the GDPR and utilize the characteristic of blockchain to address the aspects that are essential to increase trust in the system. Now, because it is possible to also track history, we have also better visibility over who and when has accessed our data. So this ultimately enables better accountability, which is one of the essential data protection principles that was introduced in the GDPR. And with granularity of access rights, we're in better control over our data as we decide whether or not certain information from our digital wallets is shared with the asking party. And also because ledgers are, as we mentioned, replicated across several computers, there's no risk of single point of failure. And in this sense, we have higher autonomy, higher authority, availability, confidentiality, and tenacity of our digital selves when we compare this decentralized approach to the conventional centralized model. And another important aspect when we talk about bringing value to privacy and data protection with blockchain is our vision with self-sovereign identities. A well-known problem with the cyberspace has always been, right, knowing who we are interacting with. And our digital identity has always been treated from the point of view of their organization managing it, and not from the perspective of the users who should be owning their identities. The concept of self-sovereign identity aims at giving to users full control of their identities, along with all of the identity-related attributes. And with this concept, the user is a central actor, controlling everything related to its identity in a digital wallet that contains verifiable claims like passport, medical records, degree certificate, and whatnot. And these claims can be used in healthcare, finance, government, literally wherever they are trusted. And users can exercise their full freedom of choice when presenting them to whoever they interact with, basically. And blockchain is actually the technology that allows the model of self-sovereign identity to work. And from a privacy perspective, there are several benefits from this model of digital or decentralized identities. Verifying our attributes could be done with using zero-knowledge proof protocol that makes it possible, say, to prove an attribute without disclosing or revealing any additional information. For example, you can prove that you're older than 18 years without actually disclosing your date of birth. Another point is that attributes can also be limited to the absolute minimum necessary. So we can have our age, our blood type, health vitals in different claims, and these can be exchanged off-chain via encrypted and secure channels. And in this way, we're upholding the GDPR principles of data minimization and data security. And in PharmaLedger, we have established an identity management task force, bringing experts from across our scientific and business community to work on self-sovereign identities for our solutions. This is a key component, actually. Now, as a last point, I'd like to wrap up by briefly stating that privacy and data protection feature very high in PharmaLedger. We have a specifically designated work package working on providing the ethical and legal backbone framework for the project, paying special attention to EU data protection and privacy legislation. We're also working on a comprehensive overview of guidelines for compliance with the relevant principles, which are to be reflected in the technical requirements of our platform and use cases. And our methodology for our privacy by design is illustrated to the left of your screens, where you can see 7 key activities, and each one of them is a step leading to the next one in the circle, suggesting that data privacy is a continuous rather than a one-off process. This allows us to experiment and learn along the way to adapt our approach if there is a potential roadblock from a privacy perspective. And with this, I'd like to hand it over to Baldwin, who will talk you through our eConsent use case for clinical trials. Thanks. Baldwin, over to you.
Thank you, Nenad. Welcome, everyone. My name is Baldwin Mack. I'm based in Canada, but I work at Boehringer Ingelheim in the global clinical operations organization. And I'm happy to speak to you today about the eConsent use case that's part of the PharmaLedger suite of use cases that Hernando talked about earlier. I'm one of the co-leads on this with some of our other partners on this initiative. And when we look at eConsent in this use case, we're not just looking at the step of consenting a patient, but in fact, we're also considering what this means for the conduct of a clinical trial as a whole, especially with respect to a patient's rights and safety. So to do this, we need to think about this holistically because data privacy really begins with the recruitment of patients in clinical trials. This has huge implications throughout the trial and beyond. And it starts really with the informed consent and the act of obtaining the agreement from a subject who wishes to participate in a trial. Now, once the consent is obtained, the trial participant undergoes a screening process to determine their eligibility. And if they're deemed eligible, they are entered into the trial where they're given study medication, and they start to perform procedures. And at each of these steps, data is collected, including personal health data, health information. And once all of the data from the trial is collected and analyzed, there's sharing of data afterwards. Now, to ensure quality and compliance, measures are put into place in our current practices to make sure that the procedures are done appropriately and that the data is collected in accordance to the protocol and also to the consent of the patient. However, in spite of the measures that we put into place and our best efforts, we do see common issues that occur through inspections from health authorities. And you can see here on the screen that over 50% of the most frequent findings relate to inadequate processes to ensure quality of the clinical trials, and similarly in inaccuracy or incomplete clinical records. We also see that a percentage of these inspections relate to non-compliances to the protocol and also the informed consent. The current clinical trial processes are largely paper-based, but also involve multiple systems that are centralized, which require manual transfer of data and verification. So really, we're faced with challenges in trust, transparency, and and efficiency. Now, as Nenad spoke about earlier, as healthcare is increasingly being digitized, we see an opportunity for blockchain to be used to address some of these issues in a clinical trial setting. And we envision a clinical trial that can be conducted on a blockchain platform where trial information such as the consent status, eligibility, expected procedures to be completed, or even completion of procedures, things like that can be put onto the blockchain and made available to all the stakeholders that are part of a clinical trial. And this could be done through one trusted, immutable, shared source of data. This platform can also facilitate automation of processes and enforce a trusted environment. At the same time, the access of the data can be managed by permissions and be made available in pretty much near real time to create the level of transparency that we currently don't have amongst our stakeholders. Now, the key component in a clinical trial is the informed consent process, because this describes what is done in a clinical trial. And through the consent form, trial participants become aware of, for example, the purpose of the trial, the descriptions of the procedures they're being asked to perform, the risks and benefits for their participation, and any alternative treatments for their condition, and most importantly, the rights and privacy as a trial participant. This process can be cumbersome, but it's really important to remember a couple of things. That one, that the content of the consent is understandable to the patient, that they're allowed the time to answer questions, and also allowed the time to really consider their agreement to participate. But the consenting process is not just about the act of getting that signature from the trial participant. It's really about how well this agreement is adhered to during the trial. And as we can see in our GCP inspections, 2 to 7% on average of non-compliances from these inspections are related to non-compliances in the consenting process. For example, timeliness of consenting or procedures that are done when consent wasn't even given. And this is largely because the process is paper-based right now, and it's prone to error. and this is really important because it has huge impact on patient safety and rights. Now, as Nenad sort of talked about blockchain technology and how it works, we believe that this technology can really help to help us to adhere to the patient's consent and ultimately address and maintain the rights and safety in the clinical trial. And how we can do this is by placing the trial participants' consent on a blockchain, and that agreement can be leveraged to inform everyone that's in the trial on what needs to be done during the trial. So how can this help? Well, as you can see in this diagram, this is a cartoon of all the potential stakeholders that are in a clinical trial setting. There are many different interactions and many different exchanges. The challenge that we face now is the flow of information is complex and inefficient. It's prone to non-compliances, as I mentioned earlier, due to siloed information and manual processes. And this creates poor transparency and a lack of trust, requiring manual spot checks to be done to identify and contain errors. In fact, the non-compliances that we see currently in clinical trials are usually discovered after the fact, after they've occurred, sometimes weeks or months. Now, what can this look like on a blockchain environment? To reiterate, a blockchain is essentially a digital ledger that records transactions and agreements. An identical copy of the ledger can be held by each stakeholder in this ecosystem. Once information is placed on the blockchain, it cannot be changed or amended without the knowledge and agreement of all the relevant parties. So how would you use this in the clinical trial situation? So again, going back to the informed consent, we can place this agreement, the agreement of the trial participant, that can be recorded on a blockchain platform and used to manage what should and should not be done with a particular patient. If there are any changes to the consent, for example, if a patient decides to withdraw from the trial, this change is known to everyone within this network at the same time, and this can automate processes that can prevent further collection or analysis of data that's collected from this individual. So this is one example of how blockchain can be used in a clinical trial, but there can be other applications within the clinical trial setting and within healthcare that can address a lot of these issues. So in part, this putting up a clinical trial in the blockchain ecosystem can increase transparency, security, trust, and efficiency. So in terms of the value within the clinical trial, what does this look like? So with regards to transparency, you can have an immutable record of a patient's consent status on a blockchain, and the nature of how that's put into the blockchain creates a natural audit trail that's available to everyone. The visibility of what's happening in trial would is immediate for everyone who has access to the ledger. And this would include the trial participants and possibly even regulatory authorities in real time. It can also decrease risk of fraudulent data and also ensure adherence to the protocol. So the benefit of that is that we can foresee a reduction in non-compliances and closer adherence to GDP regulations. In terms of trust, there may no longer be a need to transcribe and transfer data, as everyone has access to a single trusted source of data. And trial participants are more empowered to decide what happens to their data and what information they wish to share. And lastly, with respect to efficiency, we can foresee that efficiencies can be realized through more timely informing patients of changes to the protocol, for example, or awareness of changes in the trial consent for a particular patient. This value proposition can be seen and had by many stakeholders within a clinical trial. And we spoke a little bit about the value proposition for trial participants, clinical sites, and even sponsors, and possibly even regulators. For a regulator, there could be greater visibility and confidence that the informed consent is contained and recorded appropriately. And as we mentioned, this can happen in real time, whereas now it's really seen by the regulators after the trials have been completed through inspections. Efficiencies could also be gained on that end through more timely awareness of changes in the trial, and possibly even help regulators to triage sites or trials for potential inspections. So overall, we see that this technology can increase patient empowerment and engagement, and increase transparency and trust, and possibly increase efficiency and reducing costs of how we do our clinical trials. But as with any new technology, we also are aware that there are barriers to adoption. And with blockchain, this is also true. And these barriers to adoption can be grouped into two general categories: technological and non-technological barriers. And the scope of PharmaLedger is really to try and address these barriers that Hernando had spoke about earlier. But overall, we believe that blockchain technology has the potential to transform healthcare by empowering patients and increasing their engagement, increasing transparency and trust. And this can only be realized when broader adoption of this technology is had. And the work in PharmaLedger is really to help to increase the adoption within the broader healthcare community by addressing both the technological and non-technological challenges. And and ultimately, once we create a win-win situation for all stakeholders with blockchain technology, we feel that that would be the ultimate goal of what we're aiming to do here. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Hernando. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Baldwin. So we hope this has been as informative as we'd hope it to be. We also now want to take on some questions. So if there are any questions, please use the chat feature and let us know, and we'll address them. So at the moment, we don't see anything. We'll give it a second or two. Michelle, no questions on your end? So maybe what we can do is I can prompt you, Nenad, for a couple of things. In our normal course of events, as we try to identify ways and we can really bring this technology into the forefront in our trial space. Again, the rate limiting step always seems to be GDPR, yeah, and that the patient's ability to be forgotten. So can we talk a little bit at a very high level of how the landscape is changing, or what we've seen so far that you've seen in the PharmaLedger projects that are enabling a little bit more of that possibility for a patient to be forgotten within these trials?
Right. Thanks, Hernando. And this is a very valid question because obviously one that we cannot avoid when we talk about the GDPR and blockchains. And as I mentioned, the general principle in PharmaLedger is that we're using blockchain only to anchor the specific data sharing units that come on top of the blockchain, and they will be separately stored off-chain. And it is these data sharing units that contain personal information. So whenever there is a request for erasing personal data, and assuming that all the legal requirements for granting erasure are met, because the right to erasure is not absolute right, then we can break the link between the data sharing unit and the blockchain, and this prevents anyone from being able to associate a data source identifier with a relevant blockchain identifier. And just like with conventional data storage servers, data can be deleted from off-chain servers without much trouble. And one point that I like to stress is that as we're in the process of learning, we're also testing the likelihood of identifying a specific end user on the platform based solely on these identifiers or hashes on the blockchain. And the GDPR itself recognizes that when identification requires a lot of manpower and resources, and also beyond state-of-the-art tech, then essentially that piece of information should be considered as anonymous data. And the Court of Justice of the European Union also suggested that legal constraints on access to the key to re-identify let's say, key coded data, could also render data anonymized rather than pseudonymized under certain circumstances. So for these data, the right to erasure wouldn't even apply because anonymous data fall outside of the scope of the GDPR. And also at the same time, the French Data Protection Authority has issued an official opinion on blockchains, arguing that the very architecture of blockchain means that such identifiers are essential for its proper functioning. And therefore, they consider that this data cannot be further minimized, and that the retention periods are by essence in line with the blockchain's duration of existence, as they say it. And therefore, it can be argued that the existence of such hashes on blockchains, combined with the necessary privacy-enhancing mechanisms, will fulfill the GDPR requirements. I hope that clarifies a little bit of our approach in PharmaLedger. Yeah.
Yeah, and you actually taught me something, so I appreciate that so much. Thank you. Baldwin, let me turn to you for a second. So my question to you, knowing a little bit about the work you've done and knowing the work that's being done in the ledger, right? What makes the eConsent use case a little bit more unique than a traditional consent process? Where does it go beyond what we normally have in consent?
Right, Hernando. I think I think what we're doing is, as I mentioned, is not just focusing on how we consent, the actual process of getting a patient's signature on a piece of paper or a document. It's really about the essence and intent of what that signature means, and we're leveraging blockchain to translate what's on the paper to what is actually what is being done in a clinical trial. And I think the power of blockchain is that it can help us to do that, and it can also help us, as I spoke about, potentially minimize a lot of the issues that we see, a lot of the non-compliances that we see. I mean, ultimately, it's really about the patient ensuring their rights and safety in the clinical trial and not violating anything that they did not agree to do. So it's a bit subtle, but really it's the holistic idea of what the intent of that consent means and translating that in a digital way in a clinical trial environment.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's very insightful. We actually have a question coming in from the participants. So let's take a look. Let's see. How is blockchain different from other digitization initiatives for clinical trials? Bowen, I think that would be for you.
Yeah, and without knowing what other initiatives are being referred to, I don't know if I can necessarily answer that question. Maybe we need some clarification on that.
Let me turn it back to that question. If you can just give us a little more clarity, we'll come back to you. But let me now, Nenad, let me ask you a question. In this environment, who's responsible for compliance in a blockchain environment?
Right. In PharmaLedger, we have a work package that are working on the governance issues of the platform. And there are a couple of governance options on the table, and depending on which one will be chosen at the end of next year, I believe, we'll be able to know more about this. But in general, when we talk about blockchain, we expect there to be joint controllership, right? The GDPR says that there has to be a party who will be responsible to compliance with the GDPR rules. And because there's no one party who's deciding on the means and purposes of all processing activities in a blockchain, that's why we expect there to be a joint controllership, because there will be several actors who have a decisive influence over certain aspects of the collection and transmission of the personal data. And in principle, the literature, and it appears that there's sort of a general agreement on this, that it is the nodes that add and process data on the ledger, but also those who store off-chain in their local storage servers that will qualify as joint controllers.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We actually have some more questions coming in, so let me address these. So what would be the next steps short term to increase the adoption of blockchain in clinical trials?
That's a really good question. I mean, as you saw, blockchain is really about the interaction of different stakeholders, and a lot of what we're doing right now, they seem like really small use cases, but I think with each step, we're moving forward. I think the big piece is around knowledge. Um, the short-term piece is around knowledge and awareness of what blockchain is. Because right now, as Nenad said, there are different flavors of blockchain, most of which raises more questions than answers. The type of blockchain that we're working on is different from what we know is in terms of the realm of cryptocurrency. So I think for me, the next short step is really increasing awareness of all the different stakeholders. So patients, clinical sites, but even ethics committees and regulatory authorities. Once we have those groups on board with a good understanding of what blockchain is and what potential it can bring, then we can start working together to understand, well, how can we use this and what benefit that this will bring to that environment. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. However, it's not
Okay,
mine,
good.
but I think it does. Yeah, fantastic.
Perfect.
So let's see. Here's an interesting question that came in because it deals directly with patients, right? Who are at the core of everything we do.
Mm-hmm.
How are patients perceived? How do patients perceive the adoption of blockchain in clinical trials? How are the patients perceiving the adoption of blockchain in clinical trials? And before you answer that, I just want to remind the audience that we do have patient advocacy groups joining us as well. So we are a slightly different buildup of this consortium, if you will, because we really did take into account that the patient has to be taken into consideration. That's why we brought in those organizations. But Baldwin.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, at BI, one of our core focuses is on patient centricity, and also patient engagement. And prior to our participation in PharmaLedger, we ran a pilot in a clinical trial involving real life patients, and we had some feedback from that experience. And the feedback was largely really positive. I want to say that the perception and adoption of blockchain really comes with the execution of the technology. So just explaining blockchain to someone who may not know what blockchain is might not be informative for them, but it's really how it translates to their how they use it. So in a clinical trial, the pilot that we use, we saw an increased sense of engagement and empowerment in the patient to be able to see what's going to happen to them and decide at a quick glance what they need to do and what they can do in terms of the consent, but also the procedures in the trial and what's coming up. So so from that small pilot, we got really positive reception to how we executed the technology.
Yeah, and I believe you published from that, right? Wasn't there a periodical that was also released?
Not yet. We hope to have that to come out shortly.
Okay, fantastic. There's a question that came up which will allow me to give you guys a break. Maybe I can answer one. Is it historically rare to see pharma competitors collaborating on technology transformation? Why for PharmaLedger is this possible? Okay, so it's a great question because if you're not built or part of the industry, one could derive that we're competing against each other. The fact of the matter is that the science is where the competitive nature starts. A lot of the work that we do is so governed that we all have to conduct it in the same way. So trials are conducted the same way, whether you work at Pfizer or MSD or Novartis or even Boehringer, yeah? And that allows us to look at the work we do as pre-competitive work, right? It's in our best interest, all of us, to be able to have processes, procedures, and even technologies that help us all, right? Get our patients through the trials quickly, safely, and then also let the science speak for itself. Yeah, so the competitive nature of our industry is really in the science. We're not necessarily competing for patients. We're just trying to get our science out to patients. With PharmaLedger, what allows this to happen is that this is research. Yeah, so we've all agreed that we're going to do this together under the umbrella of research organization. And from here, at the end of our projects, it's well within the right of all of these partners that you see on the screen in front of you to be able to take this development, these MVPs and these modules or these solutions and bring them in-house, right? So hopefully that answers that question. Let me turn over to Nenad, and I couldn't believe this. The lawyer is getting more questions than anyone else. How's that for a living, huh? Are regulators and industry providers aligned on the case of blockchain?
Yeah, we have a specifically designated task on bringing the regulators up to speed with what's happening in PharmaLedger, and there is actually a lot of activities going on this year. So we hope that we can bring them on our side on why we believe that blockchain is the solution for many of the hurdles that they're also experiencing. So I would say stay up tuned for that.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, I think we've got one more for you. What are we doing? We're good on time, yeah. So how is the use of blockchain reconciled with how energy intensive this technology can be? Environmental concerns at the top of my agenda. It's a good question. Let me see if I can give this a shot. So yes, it's understood. Blockchain does pull a little more CPU power than the general server, one would say. The challenge for us right now is to mature the technology so that PharmaLedger in of itself can, not so much PharmaLedger, but the industry as a whole can actually take advantage of this technology. There are savings on the other side of this where we may see the CPU output and the energy required to run some of these massive algorithms and use cases, right, on servers that are distributed through ledger systems. That will eventually come down, right? So as we see the cost of an entrance technology always be very high, we're anticipating that as the adoption becomes greater, hopefully the cost gets spread out through even more participants, and that generally will be a reduction in some costs. I don't know at the moment that that's the best or greatest answer you can get, but I think we understand that this technology is more progressive and we'll see more of it, not less of it. It is, after all, supporting a monetary system. Right, so from the silver to gold to now electronic monetary system, but I think that speaks volumes to what the capabilities are. So I don't know that we'll be walking away from it. I think we will find a solution that brings that consideration down a little bit.
Hernando, can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
Also, as Nenad had mentioned earlier, there are different flavors of blockchain, and what you understand as a standard blockchain in cryptocurrency does require a lot of energy, especially with the data mining and the verification of what's put onto the ledger. The blockchain that we're talking about that would be better suited for healthcare would not require that level of energy, would not require that amount of data mining. So that's another angle to answer that question.
Thank you.
It really depends on the technology, on the type of blockchain.
Excellent. Nenad, are regulators and industry providers aligned on the use of blockchain?
I spoke about this a little bit earlier. As I said, we're working with the regulators. We're convening meetings. We've already had meetings with the European medicine agencies, and we had a great feedback from their side, and we're in the process of also engaging with FDA. So we'll know more about it. So, but we're hopeful that they will be aligned with our vision in PharmaLedger.
And let me dovetail on that, because you and I are both involved with different aspects of this, but you mentioned the FDA. The question is, has PharmaLedger engaged with regulatory agencies? The short answer is yes. You just spoke of where we're actually reaching out to the FDA, but we also have a work package that's actually actively reaching out to EMA, right, FDA, and other regulatories within the EU. So our, again, speaking on how this is different than other consortiums or other consortium projects, we've taken into consideration that there's real possibilities in this research. We all see that. And so we didn't want to get to the end of a project and have this thing just sit on the shelf. We think there's viable use here. So we've reached out and tried to get the regulators involved now as we're doing the development work, so that they can have oversight and understand it. So as it comes time for this to possibly be adopted in one of our sponsor companies, there's real tangible evidence that this is something that can be used, and we're not struggling, as the story goes, uphill again within our organizations to make the use of this case. It's already been proven, it's already been vetted, and it's got, to some extent, at least some considerations from those agencies. How can I find out more information about the project and use cases? There you go. We actually do have, if it's not in the slides, we can certainly provide it afterwards. But as you can see over Nenad's right shoulder, there is a website. We don't have an app. We do have a website, and we also do have a YouTube channel, and you can absolutely get more information on that. And within that, you'll actually be able to pick up contacts as well and continue reaching out to us.
If I may add, Hernando, on this as well, we have a virtual booth at DIA, so please feel free to go and learn more about all of our use cases over there.
Yeah, we'll be there. We'll stop on by, come and say hi, and we'll shake hands with you. Let's see. I think we've got most of them. Yeah, I think that covers most of the questions. If I missed some, I do apologize. There's no malice intended. It's simply just the lack of caffeine.
Hernando, I see one of the questions again on the digital initiatives, and maybe directing that person to the PharmaLedger booth might answer some of those questions. I don't know whether, again, without knowing what the other digital initiatives are being referred to, I see blockchain really as a foundational piece, and you can see in some of the other use cases that we're working on, like Internet of Things. I think it can be used in parallel. So I would really suggest that maybe they can explore what we're doing in PharmaLedger to maybe find out more about some of the other aspects around clinical trials that we're focusing on.
Great point. Thank you for that. Okay, one more scan. Let's just take a look. Okay, it looks like the questions have slowed to a drip. I don't say anything. So let me just turn over to you. In the last 2 minutes that we have, Nenad, 10 seconds, parting thoughts?
I think that blockchain is the future for healthcare. So stay tuned to see the real change, and we need everyone on board for that. That's my main message in it. I guess. Yeah. Thanks.
Baldwin?
I would say the same. I mean, our ending slide is really about broader adoption, and without that, because blockchain is about a network of different stakeholders, without that, then we can't really move forward. So we do have within PharmaLedger a consortium of different people from different functions and backgrounds who work together, and that's really our goal to increase the broader awareness and adoption of this technology, which we believe that will transform how we do things in our healthcare industry.
Yeah, that's very well said. For me, the last thought, and I think one question that resonates with me is the one about competitiveness in the pharma industry. And I think where Boehringer, just to point out my own company, where Boehringer is transforming itself is we've basically really made it our focus to put the patient right at the center or in the forefront. And as one of our board members would say, put the patient first and the tech will follow. This is exactly that. We have put the patient first, and everything else is going to follow the technology. In this case, this, right? So we don't compete on this part of it. We compete on the science, right? That's where we think we put our best foot forward, as one would say. This technology is just going to enable that. To Nenad's point and to Baldwin's point, stay tuned. So with that, we thank you. We appreciate you taking the time this afternoon, and we wish you a good day and a good weekend. Thanks so much.